one of my favorite places to spend time. Well, thank you so much for that extremely warm, generous, very kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Shue, for the introduction to the topic and reinforcing the importance of what we're trying to do. Now, I want to begin by acknowledging, but also congratulating the large number of people and the large number of institutions and efforts that went into this labor of love, labor of wisdom, labor of courage, labor of hope. The opportunity to be able to participate in an international meaning conference hosted outside of North America, Western Europe is so important. I think if there have been two things I've consistently said in my early stage of my career through today. One has been almost everything there is still to know about meaning in life, or ever has been to know about meaning in life, is still out there because most of the world hasn't been able to be on the stage to share the ideas of the experiences of people who make up most of human history and, of course, most of human presence. So this conference is really a wonderful step toward opening the doors of knowledge, wisdom, excellent research, great science, fantastic people and partnership around the world. The second thing I often used to say is, we don't know how to increase meaning in life. I am convinced by the end of this Congress, you'll see, as I see, that's a ridiculous thing to say. There's a huge wealth of knowledge out there. So these are the wonderful people who are making this a success, including the dream team of speakers that we put together and who are very, very kind to give their time. And I know we'd all love to be in Hong Kong once again, maybe hiking, maybe getting potato chips, maybe dim sum, maybe just walking along the harbor or watching the night light show. So many things to do, so many things to see, so much wisdom to share together. But unfortunately, you just have me for the next hour, and I will do my best to make you think that I might have a little wisdom to share that I picked up along the way from other folks. I customarily like to start with this this image that used to be on a T-shirt when I was a child. I don't know who had it. I don't know where I saw it, but it stuck with me. I wouldn't say it haunted me. It more excited me. I loved the idea that I am an almost invisible, insignificant little speck in a huge span of existence. And even if we just look at what happens on Earth, even if we just look at what happens in recorded history on Earth, everything that passes before my eyes is almost nothing of what happens in life on Earth. And I love that idea. I'm speaking from a city in the United States called Fort Collins, where the historic district, this is quotes, includes buildings from the 1940s and 1950s. And of course, I'm speaking to an audience, some of whom are enjoying 6,000 years of continuous culture. So I know that even the land I live in with the buildings and its own history of sorrow and inequality and violence still is just a short part of what we can see on this planet. So for me, that is the question that I am excited by with meaning. What do we do with this existence? Can meaning be the stitching that keeps the tapestry of life together? Well, if that's what I'm thinking, if that's what's in my mind, all of the universe, life, creation, destruction, the beginning and the end of time, every experience that's ever been had by every person, everywhere, anytime, can we really boil meaning in life down to a well-being variable? And if so, is it a good thing to have? Well, it's hard to argue that we've really unpacked the notions of meaning in life until we've consulted every culture, every tradition, every history, every experience of the multiple sides of those histories, traditions, and cultures. So right now, I think we have a very, very small chunk of what it means to understand meaning in life in our hands. Even so, it is almost unequivocal to say that meaning in life, insofar as we understand it as a well-being variable, is a very, very good one to focus our attention on. Dr. Chan shared that there was some pushback. Maybe this meaning in life idea is silly or unimportant. Maybe we don't need to pay attention to it yet. Even before the pandemic and the many, many upheavals in societies and politics around the world caused us to question almost everything that there is to know and that we thought we knew about how to live life. We have begun to see researchers around the world, many of whom are giving speeches at this wonderful conference today, from Hong Kong, from China, from around the world. And we could say now, for sure, thousands of studies. I just want to share this little piece. When I defended my dissertation in the year 2005, I could honestly say I knew the meaning in life research. I think there were somewhere between 300 and 400 published research studies at the time I defended, and I knew them all. Now we are at thousands. In fact, perhaps thousands every year. So there is a wealth of knowledge, and we're starting to see research around the world. And in fact, one of our co-speakers at this presentation will talk about what we know about meaning across cultures, times around the world. That's, of course, Dr. Joa Voss. So thousands of studies, really good studies, really excellent measurement oftentimes, oftentimes very good research designs. We have biomarkers, we have scanning studies now, we have studies in the workplace, we have studies with informant reports, we have studies that track whether people will live or die. So we have good research. If you're interested in meaning in life, I give you my assurances, there's a really good chance that someone has already done a really captivating study getting at the question that is on your mind. But let's start with this thinking about, is it, quote, a good thing, one good thing, or is it perhaps several good things? And so this is a little bit of our background. Right now there's consensus. The names of some of these bubbles may change, but there's consensus that there's at least 3 dimensions of how we at least arrive at judgments of whether our own lives are meaningful. So you might think of these as 3 different search engines that we have in our heads. And if we're asked, is my life meaningful? I may look for evidence within these 3 dimensions. Again, like I said, some of these have different names, but there's quite a lot of consensus now that there are 3 and that they look somewhat like this. So the first one is coherence, the second one is purpose, the third one is significance. Other folks would refer to this as mattering, and it's still an open, empirical, and very new question whether significance and mattering are different. Because I took a stand with my friend and collaborator, Frank Martala from Finland, that significance is a good enough name for that 3rd dimension, I'll present this, but please do know that there are other configurations out there that focus a little bit more on mattering. So my life matters in some broader way. So significance, and I'm going to ask you to remember this concept because we will come back to it. Significance, judging one's life to have inherent value or worth, or perceiving that one's life matters in some way. And significance tends to emphasize the first part of that sentence, and unsurprisingly, mattering tends to emphasize the latter part. So sometimes when people assess mattering, they'll say my life matters in the grand scheme of things. My life matters in the universe. Whereas when we measure significance, you may say, I see some inherent value in my life, living life is worthwhile, and so on. But generally speaking, if you can answer yes, if you search through the algorithm in your brain for is my life meaningful, and you say my life has value, living is worth it, that's one way of answering the question, is my life meaningful? The second way is coherence, and this is one of the very old approaches to meaning, and we have an expert on this content, Travis Prue, Dr. Prue, presenting on the meaning maintenance model, which is really about how we form mental maps to operate in the world. that it's important to our psychological health to find life to be predictable and consistent. So one way of breaking this down, I'll share that at Minnesota, my background was heavily influenced by person environment fit theories. So you can see here we have person, myself, we have environment, the world, or whatever environment we exist in, and the interface, whether that is how to operate, how to fit, how to have transactions. So if we can understand that, we have a map or a grand schema, or as Beck used to talk about it, core beliefs. This satisfies a second way that we can ask the question, is my life meaningful? And then the third way, perhaps most famously proposed by Viktor Frankl, one of the great inspirations to this field and maybe the first truly psychological explorer of this notion. And this is the idea that our lives are about something. My life has a mission or an aim or an aspiration. There are a few different ways of looking at purpose within the research. There's ways that are rooted in child development, such as the work by William Damon. There are ways that are focused around personality organization, such as by Patrick McKnight and Todd Kashdan. My way of thinking about it, and the way that Frank Martel and I think about it, is possessing some number of highly valued, very personally centered, overarching goals or goals that we seek to pursue over a very long period of time. So if we think about meaning as having these three ways of thinking about it, and then if we recall that the topic of my talk is to try to come to some sort of convergence in the many ways in which we seek to intervene to improve meaning, then you might imagine that there's going to be at least these three routes. Can we help reinforce for someone that their life is worth it and has value, or that they matter? Can we help someone make sense, or in fact, maybe recreate sense in the wake of chaos, tragedy, or just the fact that life seems to change so fast and put us under so much pressure? And can we help someone see that they have something to accomplish, to work toward in their lives? So there should be at least those three themes running through meaning interventions, if what we say as researchers and self-proclaimed semi-experts is accurate. And then, of course, we return to the question of this talk. How do we get more meaning? Well, at one point, I used to say there's not much out there on how to find or increase meaning. What I really ought to say is that it doesn't feel like there's much out there that is accessible about how to find or increase meaning. And that condition is going to flip from, it feels like there's not much out there, to, oh my gosh, there's so much out there, I don't know what to do with all this knowledge, I think very, very soon in this field. So I'm going to talk about clinical trials and approaches, psychology experiments, and then a thematic model that attempts to give us a fewer moving pieces. And I'll say at the outset, as I will say throughout this talk, that I'm heavily basing the foundation of the initiation of this project on the wonderful, wonderful, and very, very difficult work that Dr. Joel Voss has done. And I believe his workshop at this conference will focus on some of the work in this area. So I highly recommend that. So let's look at clinical interventions. This is really where the psychological history of meaning starts, with Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, he was a medical doctor, he was working on interventions, he developed a therapy called logotherapy, and it was really about the practical utility of meaning and purpose, where the story of meaning in psychology begins. Now, if we just take a step back and we ask the question, what's going on with meaning in a clinical setting? Well, we start to see some really interesting clues about what we might look for and reasons we might even want to assess for meaning in clinical practice. So folks who come into clinical practice because of a lack of meaning tend to express a sharper need for therapy. They feel more acutely the pressure, the impetus to change things in their lives. Those who come into therapy in clinical settings already, so a distressed group, if they also lack meaning, they express more distress than other folks who are presenting for clinical services. And finally, especially when we think about this idea of significance, my life is worth living, we shouldn't be too surprised that if we assess for the presence of meaning in life and we do not see it in a clinical setting, that is associated in research with higher degree of suicidal ideation and more frequent suicide attempts. So right away, we might, just with this, a simple assessment of meaning, begin to flesh out the experience, the distressing experience that someone coming into a clinical setting to meet with us might have. So feeling a sharper need for therapy, experiencing more distress, those someone can present with, having higher degrees of suicidal thoughts and attempts, that's likely to be relevant throughout the course of therapy. Now, if we flip it around and again look at what happens during the course of therapy, we start to see that folks who present to us in a clinical setting who have above average levels of meaning in life generally present lower levels of psychopathology. Oftentimes that will be less severe symptomatology, fewer symptoms, even though they may meet diagnostic criteria for various disorders. They also report less substance abuse issues in their lives or substance use issues in their lives. Coming into therapy, they also report healthy relationships, and as we know from many therapeutic modalities, being able to draw on the relationships in our lives is vital. And interestingly enough, all things being equal, according to this research, if someone comes to you with the same, two people come to you with the same presenting concern, the person who has already meaning in life will improve faster in therapy, according to research. So the clinical context for meaning is already fairly interesting, I think. We start to see that maybe even the course of therapy will be different depending on what kind of meaning people are bringing with them to the clinical office. If meaning is one of the modes in which you would like to work, there are already some existing and rich theoretical approaches. So the most venerable, of course, is logotherapy by Viktor Frankl. And it's quite rich, it's quite deep, there's a lot to get through, and lots of complexity, and also some really interesting interventions, such as paradoxical interventions that stick with us today. But the fundamental idea behind logotherapy is not that humans, again, we must contextualize this in the birth of psychodynamic approaches, which posited various important wills or principles that would drive humans. The principal drive for Frankl wasn't a drive for social power, it wasn't a drive for pleasure, it was a drive for meaning, that the most characteristic human need was a need for meaning. And accompanying that comes with it some existential truths, right? This existential philosophy around what it means to confront life as a human without necessarily being able to borrow wisdom a priori that might have been given to us from religion or from nationhood or from family experience or occupation. And that would mean that we're free in all cases to take a stance in our lives towards any kind of condition. And every situation we encounter has potential to be meaningful. This is especially powerful when you think about someone like Viktor Frankl saying this and not someone like me. Viktor Frankl lost everything in the concentration camps and the Holocaust of World War II Nazi Germany. So he came into that experience believing in the power of purpose, and he left that experience believing not only in the power of purpose, but in the power of freedom and choice. And it suggests that we can look in a few different directions to foster meaning or explore meaning in our lives. We can try to express creativity in the things that we do. We can relate to each other. And of course, this attitudinal stance, especially in the face of suffering. Another well-developed approach is existential analysis by Alfred Lengler. And this tries to support clients to develop authentic and responsible attitudes towards their lives. Part of what I really love about this approach is it's a joyful approach. It's an approach that feels very liberating for folks. And how I feel like that is captured in some of what Lengler has written and talked about is this idea that we want to experience ourselves freely and also freely consent to the world and life. We don't feel like a prisoner in the circumstances of our lives. We consent to what's happening, even if the circumstances are not what we necessarily would choose. And so one of the goals of pushing in existential analysis would be to coax clients to feel very free and comfortable saying, yes, I exist, my life is good, I can be myself, and I can achieve my goals. So you see an infusion of hope, you see an infusion of purpose, you see an infusion of authenticity. I think it's a really lovely approach. Then we have Paul and Lillian Wong's approach to meaning therapy. And Paul's great with language and has also faced quite a bit of difficulty in life, which is giving additional weight to his arguments, right? So meaning therapy will focus on helping people build a sense of freedom, but with freedom comes responsibility. Responsibility to pursue what matters. And one of the quotes that Paul has is, meaning is all we have, relationship is all we need. So for the meaning therapy approach, we are in a network of others, and we can never forget that. One of the big landmark approaches over the last 10 years and increasing in importance is meaning-centered psychotherapy by Breitbart and many excellent colleagues. This initially began as a logotherapeutic inspired approach, focusing on helping cancer patients recover and move forward in their lives. There's quite a lot of emphasis on identity and on really establishing what it means to see changes in oneself based on the struggle, in this case specifically with cancer, that one has experienced. And there's a couple new approaches that are getting some research attention, but are sort of similar, looking at how we cope, looking at how we cope with illness, how do we rest our sense of identity on a changing platform when we are looking at chronic illness in our lives. So are these easy things? Is this like writing 3 things down at the end of the day? Is this like watching cat videos on YouTube? No, this is harder stuff. These approaches, these psychotherapeutic approaches, are not easy, but meaning is about building durable flourishing, not about simply cultivating states that we hope will last long enough to stave off a sense of dread or despair. Well, you're starting to see a name pop up quite a lot, and we're going to see that for the next 20 slides, that I am going to reveal some of the amazing work that Joel Voss and his colleagues did. I'm also going to rely on what parts I could read and translate. A review by Kang was written in Korean, so I wasn't able to get all of it, but I was drawing on these sources to start off with, to try to uncover what we can of the empirical foundations of meaning-based practices. And if you look at these dates, Dr. Voss has been doing this for 8 years now and has really published high-impact works for the last 4 years as well. So there's a lot there. I'm not going to hold you in suspense. Do any of them work? A lot of them work, it seems like, at least as far as we traditionally assess clinical outcomes. So this is Voss. And I'll give you a picture of this book at the end, so you can definitely buy it. You'll enjoy it. You'll get a lot of richness out of it. But this is a meta-analysis of many, many meaning-based practices. How many? 392 trials with 28,808 patients. Just think about working through that mountain of data in a systematic way. I think it's really one of the landmark achievements within this field. So meaning is a common therapeutic factor, and not just seeing the meaning-centered therapies that I reviewed already, such as meaning-centered psychotherapy or logotherapy. And this is going to be our first sign of good news, right? So the overall effect size in beta was 0.37. That's larger than median. So we see that there is an effect of meaning as a common therapeutic practice. And in fact, according to Voss's analyses, just shy of 14% of the total positive outcomes in these psychotherapeutic trials could be linked to meaning-based practices. So someone like me, I read this and I'm like, well, what are these meaning-based practices? How many of these can we do? And there's a little bit of suspense before I reveal some of these, but Voss identified 30 of these meaning-focused practices. And when comparing pre-post changes compared to control groups in these cases, these practices were associated with large effects in all of these areas. These are well-being areas that we typically see emphasized within positive psychology. In some cases, we also see these emphasized within clinical approaches, self-efficacy being an important part of many cognitive behavioral approaches. And in a lot of cases, we see psychological stress as a transdiagnostic risk factor that we want to be working towards as well. So large effects for all of these outcome variables. These aren't the specific symptom reduction metrics that were piled into the beta, the 0.37 beta effect size on the previous slide. But it does give us hope that when we implement these sorts of practices, changes do occur. And it's not a tiny bit of research out there. There are thousands of people enrolled in multiple trials. So we can find this stuff. When we want evidence that meaning and focusing on meaning works and benefits people, we will be able to find it. So if we take a step back and take a look at the meaning-specific therapies, that's another strategy we can take to answer the question, can we do anything to increase meaning? So these meaning-centered therapies are like the ones I already mentioned, the logotherapy, existential analysis. And this is another meta-analysis executed by Joel Voss and his colleague Vitali. And again, we see a range of effect sizes, but in this case, we start to see symptomatology changing. So and we can also see that follow-up starts to be an important factor. So when we take a look at meaning, we see large effect sizes, even at the end of treatment and also over long-term follow-ups. And we start to see that there are also some symptoms that seem to change immediately, some symptoms that seem to persist in changes at following up at a variety of times, and that stress and social relationships can be benefited. So this will start to feel, I think, like a mountain of words I'm throwing at you. Part of that is to give you enough to see, like, if you are interested in relationship building, that you'll be able to see that someone has done work to identify treatments that affect that. Some of it is to see, like, if you're curious about specific practices, as we'll see soon, we have a long, long list of these practices we can play with. Now, one of the things that I want to stress, and that Voss rightfully stresses, is that the effect sizes, at least across well-being and quality of life measures, equals or exceeds some of the more famous or more attended to approaches to helping people improve their lives. Now, there's something ontological about the way that existential and humanistic therapies sometimes don't feel that aggregating data into a generic change is important, that there's so much about the individual journey that's critical to those approaches. Maybe that means they've been a little meek in talking about their successes, but the successes of these approaches are similar to what we would see for acceptance and commitment therapy, which is, a friend has a family resemblance to meaning approaches. Other positive psychology interventions would certainly get a lot of attention, and these life review, life narrative building approaches here, structured life review and autobiographical writing. So this is good news, right? We can already feel excited by this. Just two sources from Joel Voss already give us a strong sense of hope. Now, I want to know in this talk, what is going on in there? Like, what are the interventions that move the needle? And I've already alluded to the fact that at some point I'll shift gears to talk about psychological experiments, because those are also causal models. So that's the real goal. How do we look at the themes that exist within this work that Voss identified? What are the themes, interventions, and practices? And in particular, how can we look inclusively for points of overlap and connection to sort of build a broad ingredients list that we can dip into to create specific approaches for meeting with folks? One of the ways to start, these are meaning-centered approaches, of course, already, but when those meaning-centered approaches included these particular elements that Voss and Vitali identified, they achieve larger effect sizes than when they were not in that therapeutic modality. So a couple of these are, the ones in green are the ones that I advance into my bucket of themes to consider, because they're pretty tangible. They could be replicated. Structured versus unstructured isn't really meaning specific, and excluding religious or spiritual formations, while very important, is also, again, not really a meaning intervention. We're already excluding religious spiritual formulations, so that doesn't feel like an intervention that I would put into this model that I'm trying to build. But explicitly urging clients to set achievable goals in daily life, particularly for a concept that can sometimes seem so vague as meaning and purpose, like rooting things in daily life is really important. And we'll see this a few different times. Meaning-centered psychotherapies that utilized or embraced mindfulness exercises had larger effect sizes. Those that were explicit about discussing meaning. I think this is wonderful because one of the things I really feel that we've let these emerging generations down with is that we don't treat meaning as something that everyone should be able to talk about just as easily as they talk about the weather or about the latest app that they've been playing. Meaning is more important, and yet we talk about it less. Addressing issues of self-worth and identity, discussing our existential limitations. I think we feel a lot of those in this present moment of crisis in the world. And of course, focusing on a positive therapeutic relationship. This is obviously an important common factor across therapeutic modalities. The reason it's in green here is because we'll start to see replication of this in other sorts of ways later on. Now, in Voss's book, Dr. Voss also goes through and identifies these specific meaning-centered skills. One of my favorite, you wouldn't be surprised, are meaning-centered didactics. How do we understand principles of meaningful living? Principles are no good, though, unless we keep them front and center and we learn how to live with them in our own lives. So there's a lot of rooting in the client's life. And this should be more important in a moment in history where the long term looks so dire if we don't change things, and yet we still seem to be caught up in so many short-term distractions. So perhaps meaning-centered approaches can save us from just twiddling our thumbs until the big day comes when it's too late to do anything. So meaning potential in client's life, offering realistic hope that we can find meaning, a full range of possible sources of meaning. This is a talk in and of itself, but some of us might find meaning in our work, some in our spiritual and religious lives, some in our hobbies, some in our goals. We need to look at a variety of sources of meaning. We go from the general and abstract to specific, and again, we see that rooting things in daily life is effective. We support good goals. We encourage this time embrace. I love this concept of experiencing the whole complexity of time, that in any given moment in time, we're experiencing the past, the present, and the future, and can utilize all three of those as a source of meaning or a source of moving forward. We can also look to our past as a source of hope for future meaning, which is interesting, right? Because in the present, we look to our past to find hope for the future. So it's very existential sort of idea there. And I think it's also an intuitively good idea. Authenticity in social contexts, and then bolstering self-worth. So we see some familiarity between the Voss and Vitale paper and the Voss paper here. And all of these things get advanced into the theme battle towards the end. Now, if you're curious, Dr. Voss also assorted those skills into 7 that were focused mainly on mindfulness and phenomenology. So how can we enter with a questioning and humble stance towards life so that we can immerse ourselves in life as it happens, but also derive meaning from it? And then existential specific skills that sounded quite a lot like what Frankl was helping us to understand, and what Langland and others were helping us understand, that life can feel paradoxical. We can build meaning from suffering and setback. We can look at some of the most important experiences in our lives as ones we hope we never have to go through again, and so on. So I think that if you like to put things in categories already, we've got some mindfulness phenomenology, and then we've got more meaning-specific skill sets. Well, that book was published in 2018, and I know that Dr. Voss is very active in diving into literature again, but I thought I'd do my own dive into literature. And so with the theme being inclusivity, I wanted to catch everything that I could. I start with Google Scholar, which all sorts of things show up in Google Scholar that aren't journal articles, but it catches almost everything that's going to come up. And the search term meaning in life, very broad again. Some articles, if you search long enough, the only term that's bolded in the results is the word in this case, but I had a lot to look at. In fact, maybe too much. So I just looked at the first 100 pages of results with 10 results per page. So the first 1,000 entries that showed up and I went year by year. So the first 1,000 entries for 2017, 18, 19, 20, and 21. And already in 2022, as of April 7th, we already had 1,000. So that's pretty exciting to be having a meeting conference on the cusp of a year in which 1/4 of the way into it, there were already 1,000 entries. So this yielded about 6,000 entries, 1,000 per year. I figured anything that was after that, maybe I'd catch someday, but I was willing to let that go just to finish someday with this search. And my goal was to identify original publications that presented research that included empirical results and statistical analyses that could indicate positive change in a meaning life indicator due to some treatment or intervention condition. So everything that I review has causal inference because of the study design. The way that I looked at these results, and you can try this yourself if you'd like to, I just focused on entries that had titles that clearly or even just barely suggested some form of data would be in them. Again, this isn't a rigorous meta-analytical approach. This is just seeking what shows up over and over and over again. I read the abstract for each of those entries. This was, a low year would maybe have 300 abstracts that I would take a look at. A more busy year would have maybe 500. And you'll see by the end that most of these did not have the causal design I was looking for, or referred to it in a way that I couldn't find any statistical results to report. All the qualifying, anything that looked tempting, I read the methods to see what the design was, and then if that qualified, I'd look through the results, and I would, if that all looked good, I would then look through the method that they used and pull themes of what interventions they deployed from the methodological description. I sorted this into clinical interventions and experiments. We're going to talk about the clinical interventions first. So here's some themes. I mean, I would encourage you to do this. It takes a little while, but it's really fascinating. But one pronounced trend was an uptick in research on maybe psychotherapies that are famous, right? Cognitive behavior therapy, couples therapy, Gottman-focused couples therapy, behavior therapy, lots of the classics that you probably have heard of if you've taken a look at clinical psychology. So there are a lot of applications of doing these therapeutic trials and then using meaning as a dependent variable. I would say well over half of these trials were from our colleagues in Iran. There's a lot of fruitful things going on there, but there are also really interesting applications, and I've included a few samples here. Therapies that would look at meaning as an outcome among firefighters in South Korea, nurses in Taiwan, and university students in Saudi Arabia, among others. There are also quite a number of family resemblance therapies like art therapy, mindfulness therapy, narrative-focused therapies, drama, and volunteering therapy, even walking therapies that you could imagine are really, copacetic with or friendly with meaning in life, but aren't specific. And I did not include those articles in the present review. So these are really meaning-focused approaches, kind of a continuation of the fundamental work that Voss did. I was able to find 31 additional articles published between 2017 and 2022 that identified meaning as an outcome of a meaning-specific therapeutic approach. The sample populations were kind of all over the place, like really diverse. Again, you might see a population of your own interest here, but individuals struggling with psychosis or psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, cancer, patients dealing with cancer, chronic illness, pain, people recovering from strokes, people in substance use treatment paradigms, individuals in nursing homes, bereaved parents, and others suffering from grief. All of these were represented in this batch of articles that I found. And this is a list, right? So this is a big list. A lot of these therapies were specific to life review therapy or meaning-centered grief therapy or logotherapy, meaning-centered psychotherapy from Breitbart, and those all share common features. And so those common features, all of the ones that Voss and Vitali identified go into the bucket. And these were other ones that came up in the descriptions of the therapeutic trials that folks were reporting their data on. So helping people develop a guiding philosophy, their core values, understanding culturally valued maxims. Of course, that's going to be different from culture to culture. So again, we have this conference to thank quite a bit for being able to open up a new window and hopefully empower a lot of people to dig into their cultural setting to find hints about meaning and meaningful living. Health, mindfulness, self-compassion, strengths, life planning, forgiveness, expressive arts, appreciating life and self, lots of thinking about events, encouraging people to develop skills to find meaning anywhere, gratitude. So we're already seeing some positive psychology interventions. We're seeing some really meaning-focused approaches, getting a meaning action plan. I love that idea. Meaning isn't just a motto, it's a thing you do. Emotion regulation, enlisting people in peer helping relationships, other relationships, hope, cognitive restructuring, which in a sense is meaning making, increased social participation. So this is a common one in cases of like psychotic disorders, for example, active coping and crafting a life narrative. So right there, we have a list on top of all the stuff that Voss and Vitale identified of additional elements of these meaning-centered approaches to helping people find meaning. So meaning focused on meaning. Now, where they're colored green was where I was able to find more than one trial from an independent source that included those elements and also noted successful increases in meaning in life. So in a sense, this is a replication of concept. It's not the same thing as replication of a specific therapeutic modality. That's not my goal in this talk. But these green ones are ones that would show up in more than one of these 31 articles that I found. The yellow here is one that shows up in the list that Voss and Vitale or that Voss put together, but in only one extra article. So it gets carried forward because it was identified previous to 2017 when I began looking. So from the clinical approaches, these are some of the themes and organized efforts to try to build someone's sense of meaning in life. Now, one of the things that doesn't often get brought together, and maybe this is just because of my background in counseling psychology and social and personality psychology, are the experiments. But also positive psychology is like a mashup of social psychology and clinical psychology. So we ought to be, in my opinion, it's fruitful to look at any place where folks are exerting causal influence over folks and how their meaning comes to bear. I think the most famous example, I don't know how to determine what's famous, but a lot of folks I know this story with Laura King, and we have, speaking at this conference, Dr. Samantha Heinzelman, who also worked with Dr. King, and you'll probably recognize the name Joshua Hicks, who has quite a fruitful and generative career in social psychology looking at meaning as well. But in this case, simply inducing people to feel more positive emotions also saw an increase in meaning in life. So we see something being changed in a causal paradigm that increases meaning in life. Between 2017 and 2022, I was able to find 40 more experimental papers. To be honest, there's not that many more before 2017, so I did tuck a few in from 2008, 2014, whatever ones I could identify. So there's been at least 40 experimental papers, and like all good experiments, there's multiple studies within each one. So the key features of these experiments is yet another list. Now, you already know my methods, so anything that's yellow would have been advanced from the clinical list previously. So there was one clinical study that looked at crafting a life narrative. It didn't replicate in the clinical basis, but it did show up again in this area of experimental studies. Likewise, nostalgia was something that came from the clinical literature as well. So some of these already come to us having been replicated in kind, or at least in concept, in the clinical literature. So to me, that's really fascinating to see where some of this stuff comes together. You might also argue that self-affirmation is similar to the way in which we build self-worth. To me, they feel just enough different that I didn't count that. So this is a list of the experimental activities. So you would have someone reflect on the meaning in events, take a look at whether the control group had higher or lower meaning than the group that reflected on meaning in events, and you would say they do, so that counts as 1+ in that column. There's an interesting example here, a counterexample, where folks had people focus on extrinsic goal orientation. And so extrinsic goals are ones that aren't personally important to us, but rather we do them for material or external gain. Maybe we want to make money. That's a classic external motivator. So here the control group was co-factoring in of narcissism scores. And when you tell people to focus on extrinsic goals, they actually experience declines in meaning in life unless they're highly narcissistic, in which case, at least in this American sample, their meaning seemed to go up. So that's just some of the examples of how these sorts of experiments are run. Anywhere that you get to infer causality, I think is a really strong possibility for taking a look at what are the levers we might want to bring together into a set of meaning interventions. Similar to the clinical interventions, there are replications here. These are from independent labs. So one example is nostalgia. There's multiple studies from a similar group. I believe it's Clay Routledge, working on nostalgia paradigms with Constantine Stodekidis. And, you know, if the same group of people finds something, we get excited, but we really would wait until we see an independent lab. Or using another example, taking meaningful photographs. Well, that was my idea. Like, I published that, and if that was all we had, it wouldn't make the list, but independent labs have now been able to replicate that. So don't trust me, trust replication. So these are the ones that made it. Belonging is good, exclusion is bad. There's quite a number of applications here. Nostalgia and other forms of time travel, whether we go back to the past or even just imagine ourselves in the future. Taking specific pro-social actions intended to help other people. Counterfactual thinking. Well, if I hadn't been born in this country, or if that accident hadn't occurred to me, what would my life be like? Or if I didn't have a mother who loved me, if I had never had this job. Like those counterfactual ideas that get you to, in your imagination, run a different kind of life. That's an existentially salient approach. I love this one, personally important experiences with art. I don't know, I'll refer again. I have a framed potato chip, Calbee hot and spicy potato chip bag behind me because I just found it so aesthetically exciting when I saw it. And I had a very personally important experience with it. So I get joy out of it every time I look at it. These little doors into meaning are available to all of us. Gratitude, I mean, really one of the favorite interventions that students in my positive psychology nominate as being helpful. It's an inherently self-transcendent approach to positive emotions, which I think makes it a wonderful partner for meaning in life. This meaningful photograph business, and then crafting a life narrative. There's one research study from the experiments, but also it shows up in the clinical literature. So it gets boosted in with a weird sort of not strict replication, but conceptual replication. So now we search for common ground. This is where we'll start to wrap up. When we bring together all the meta-analyses and the reviews that Voss and colleagues did, when we take a look at what showed up for the clinical interventions and the experimental manipulations, I feel like it's worth thinking about, or at least I was attracted to, 8 focal points and 5 themes. So the 8 focal points are intended to sort of capture in a way that's not necessarily a start to finish, but more of a circular approach to how we might think about moving from topic to topic within meaning in life. I think the most work probably has been done around intentional reflection and meaning making, being able to have a reflection capacity within us, being able to go inside our own experience and run alternative models, make sense and make meaning out of past struggles, future goals, future obstacles. I think that ends up being probably, to me, one of the most feeling pieces of this. The partner to that would be purpose-infused living, because that's so central to what Frankl has been exhorting us to do. Also in this world, this hyper marketplace-oriented world, purpose is like really exciting because it's a doing thing, it's a motivating thing. So to me, purpose is going to be best positioned in the rest of these focal points. that can help it from becoming just another corporate tool for squeezing effort out of people. So we see reflection and meaning making. You may already be seeing where that showed up in some of the lists we looked at. Awareness of in the flow of existence, the phenomenological piece that Voss identified, other parts of mindfulness, and orientation towards time. We already mentioned that. Life story and narrative, life review, that's common. Authentic self, we saw that in Langla's idea about consenting to life. We saw that in that fundamental component, dimension of meaning, coherence. Coping and self-care is probably a big piece, but that's going to be helping us get through difficult times. And then healthy relating, not just relating, but healthy relating in an authentic way that's good for ourselves and that's good for other people. So here's some examples. I'll go through these a little bit quickly, but just to let you know how I organized this search in my own mind. I looked for what showed up in Vasa Vitali's a review of meaning-focused and meaning-centered psychotherapies. I looked at what showed up in Voss's meaning skills analysis. I looked at what showed up in my own update on the clinical literature. I looked at what showed up in replicated social sources. And then sometimes I looked at some of the singular social sources because they could add a little emphasis. All has been replicated a couple of times, but mostly within, I think maybe at this point, only within Josh Hicks's lab at Texas A&M University. So we see within reflection and meaning, it's just full of topics. We want to really look at meaning. We want to use mindfulness to expand our awareness of meaning and meaning possibilities in our life. We'll focus again on meaning-centered topics. We want to look for potential, look at the full range of sources of meaning. In the clinical literature, looking at the meaning of our past events and meaning making. Believe that meaning can be found anywhere, and I would put expressive arts in this case. When you go to a great museum or even a small little gallery and you see what someone is trying to express to you, you put that in the historic and cultural context of other works, and it expands your sense of what the world is about. I think that gives us more tools for making sense of our own experience. Nostalgia and time travel, you'll see these appear in a couple cases. So they're not mutually exclusive, but they're supporting this theme. So as we go on, you see there's a little bit less directly supporting the awareness and the flow of existence, but we see a lot of replication here, right? So we see a lot of mindfulness replicating. We see meaningful photographs where you go out into your day and your assignment is simply to take a photograph that represents what makes your life meaningful. So that's an act of being present in life, at least in a moment, taking it as it comes, living freely in the life that we lead. Time, I already mentioned, I love this idea of being able to live in all sorts of moments, at all sorts of times, but also being able to use time wisely. And we can use time wisely not only in the sense of not wasting our existence, but also in thinking about our past as a real deep source of meaning, a natural and well-earned source of meaning that we can look at, and time travel to the future as well, as a way in which we can think about what our lives can represent in the future as a way to see hope and a way to see strength right now. I also love this ritualistic food consumption. There's one study out there that had people eat Oreo cookies, these chocolate wafer cookies with a white flavored interior frosting. And I guess the ritualistic consumption method was to twist them apart, lick some of the frosting, and then dunk them in milk. And people who went through that approach, as opposed to just eat them like Cookie Monster or however you like, they experienced or reported increases in meaning. And I think that fits with a lot of what Dr. Heinzelman has been and Dr. King have been showing us, that there's a lot of meaning around us that, in fact, draw on consistency in the world around us, maybe even traditions to find meaning. Life story seems very straightforward. When we think about life as a narrative, as our own story, it connects us to a really just venerable way of humans sharing experience and knowledge, from the oral tradition of tens of thousands of years ago into the present, where people watch TikTok stories for a couple minutes. So it's sharing stories, sharing our life experience, and being able to use that intentionally in our own lives to process and make sense of our experience is important. There's one line of research from Mark Landau that suggests that when people are led to view their lives in this fairly familiar, at least in many cultures, We view our lives as a journey from point A to point B, and adventures happen along the way. When we look at our own lives in that way, folks who were in that experimental paradigm reported an increase of meaning. I just haven't seen a replication of that yet, but it fits with this concept. Purpose-infused living, we love this. Goals, get it in your day, link the immediate to the big stuff, and you've got a way of turning a vague notion of meaning and purpose into a life plan that will be with you in the present and fueling your sense of meaning every day. And authentic self, I think this is a very important version of authenticity. It's not the bully who's like Dr. Evil, I'm just being honest, but using honesty as a chance to be aggressive and assaultive towards other folks, but instead really striving to be a better, represent the best version of yourself now and improve so that that best version of yourself continues to be better over time. We see that narcissists are the primary example to this, but also connecting with our true self. Rebecca Schlegel's line of research, also another person who came from some mentoring by Laura King. Coping and self-care, this one's a little bit less well developed in terms of a broad playbook, but if we take a look at cognitive restructuring here in this clinical realm, that is actually a very well developed set of tools already. It's a key part of coping with illness. It's a key part of coping with post-traumatic recovery and stress. And I think it fits well with discussing our existential limitations and cultivating an accurate and compassion-generating sense of self-compassion. And then finally, we have all sorts of relationship stuff. We haven't been able to refute Chris Peterson's wonderful quip about positive psychology in general. Other people matter. Certainly other people matter to meaning and purpose. In fact, if you recall reading Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's landmark book, many of the stories are about people living through the concentration camps and the horrific abuses because they had someone else they were living for, some sense of duty or obligation or responsibility to someone else. That was their purpose. So I like to arrange them like this. I think they kind of share similarities with each other next door. Our life story is a process of how we live purposefully across time. We ourselves need to be authentic so that we can take care of ourselves and also choose purposes that make sense to us, and so on. So this is one way of arranging them, one way of pulling themes out of this work, but hopefully it's a way that's a little bit easier than trying to read the many articles that are out there. And then I think we can take one more step back and say that there's maybe 5 real themes to this. Meaning rests on what we can do with our consciousness. Meaning rests on what we can do with our experience of time. Meaning rests on how we do and act and create in life. Meaning rests on what we do with ourselves, and in particular, what we do in relationship to other people. So some of these things are not at all specific to meaning, but for me, I think the fusion of these into an approach to meaning does give rise to some of these ideas that we just talked about: orientation to time, healthy relating as opposed to having lots of relationships necessarily. So maybe these are 5 themes then that we can keep in mind as we're generating programs, classes, educational opportunities, workshops to try to help out folks who need to improve meaning in life. So we just go back over this. This is what we took a look at. And by trying to reduce these things to such a small number of categories, what I'm really trying to hopefully do is make the scattered research feel simple and provide starting places for folks. So we have areas of concentration that are common in other areas of psychology, just like they are in meaning and life research. These are the most commonly shared themes of the successful interventions tested so far. So when we think about consciousness in the context of meaning, we can already, at least if you trust my analysis, we can already say that there is research out there on these topics. Ideally, they can bridge us to other disciplines. There's certainly a lot of neurobiological and neuroimaging research looking at consciousness. There's volunteering and social psychology looking at what it is to do. There's economics research on time use. So it can help us link to other programs in other areas. And one part that I like also is that these are essential concerns of existential psychotherapy approaches, but they're not specific to those approaches. So these are these common factors. This is like another generation of common factors like Joel Voss was discussing. So what can we actually do to find more meaning in life? A lot. Voss and Vitale found 60 trials. Voss, actually in another paper, found another one. Kang found 6 that weren't in either of those two. I found, actually I found 31 more. So that's 100 different trials across a range of populations, a range of presenting concerns, and a range of rigor, let's be honest. But there's information out there. We can feel really excited to be joining in the efforts of all these great researchers. There's also 40 papers reporting on social psychological experiments with at least 68 individual studies reported within those. And 8 of these manipulations have been replicated in independent labs so far. So I think we can feel really good, really confident. And if we take a step back, and I know I'm wrapping up and I'm going to eat a little bit into the question and answer time because I do want to pay my dues to the people whose work came before me and will come after here. But if we take a look, consciousness is really about noticing, reflecting on, and making meaning from our lived and even our imagined experiences. Time then is orienting us towards utilizing the full array of time perspectives, past, present, and future, and reminding us of the use of attention and mindfulness. Doing is intentional living. We can build our story and our purpose into our daily life towards valued aims, and we can try to be creative and integrate that experience as we go. We want to care for our authentic self and help its development along. And finally, we want to live for other people, for all of us, the people we know, the people we don't know, the other life, I believe, on this planet, that we live for the sake of all of us. We can appreciate the relationship and we can give as much, if not more, than we receive. So if you'd like to learn more, these are some of the really cool books, not all of them, but the cool ones that have a really clinical focus. There's a special issue of European psychotherapy that Alfred Langler put together with a beautiful look at existential analysis. This book with the arrow, this is Voss, 2018, Meaning in Life, a fantastic book. If you've been towards more of the coaching, this is Yannick Jacobs' book on existential coaching. He and I co-authored a chapter on meaning-focused coaching as well. He's got just a wealth of knowledge. One of our other speakers, Tamid Russo-Netzer, has this clinical perspectives on meaning. This is an edited handbook. And this is just a really beautiful book by Mick Cooper, who also has worked with Joel Voss. So these are some resources that I really like, that are in my office right now, that I like to pick up from time to time. They're not the only ones, but I think they're really special. And I also want you to know about the great talks that you have coming up, and that they all do expand our knowledge in such profound ways. You'll see that I owe a lot to Dr. Joel Voss, but also I've learned so much from so many people. And one of my early collaborations was with Dr. Satoshi Shimai, who's incredible and generative in so much research. I think you can layer some of these themes of what you're about to see if that's how you like to do things, but if you like to go one at a time, that's also important. And so I'll close on my last word. I apologize for going a little bit over time, but why do all these different interventions, from gratitude towards embracing different time frames, why do they increase meaning? And I'm going to suggest that perhaps significance is the cornerstone, the foundation on which increases in meaning in life are laid. I'll ask you to hold that thought in mind as we reflect again, like, we're here. We're one of nearly 8 billion people in a history of a species. And if we follow our cousin species back 100, 200,000 years, creating artifacts of art. We're part of life that swarms, even though we seem to be intent on extinguishing life through our daily practices right now. I know that we can change that. When things change too fast, when life gets too busy, when political world is full of upheaval, when the medical world is full of unseen threats, it can be hard, right, to know where we really stand in life. And I think if what these interventions are doing is just getting us to the point of like, I am here, I'm little, the world is huge and full of massive powers that can crush me without even noticing, but I'm okay living with that. Or at least I feel a little bit better about that. To me, that feels like the first steps that almost all of those practices can help take, whether it's healthy relating, whether it's gaining control over how we use time in our lives or attention and so on. So that's where I suggest that significance comes in, because it makes life feel worth it. There's some value. And from there, we can grow other more sophisticated or at least other versions of meaning in life. So thank you for your time. Thank you very much. I appreciate Xie for being there. I'm sorry for my terrible accent. But again, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to if you have any questions and answers, and also welcome you very much to dive into all the fantastic presentations that will come.